Well, hello everyone, hope this finds you all fit and well. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ian Duncan. I'm a performance driver coach. I go by the name of Rallycoach on social media. Over the past couple of days, I've been working on putting together this video to offer you some information and insight into how I operate with a driver in a coaching setting. Over the past 10 years or so, I've had the pleasure of working with thousands of drivers. Some of you, I'm sure, will be watching this and will be able to offer some further insight in the comments perhaps later on. I've worked with many different cars with different drivetrain types, different weather conditions and surface types, so on and so forth. But out of all of that knowledge and information, that experience, the part that really stands out to me is actually the operation of your brain and how your brain interacts with the outside world. So I've broken this down into three very specific areas. And the first part is the part of your brain that makes you who you are. It's the slowest part of your brain when you're looking at the speed of processing information. It's the cognitive part of your brain where you take in, process, digest information, turn it into a usable function. Now, this is based on your past experience, your education, your understanding of things. Many different things will hinge on that. But for me, this cognitive process is the foundation on which everything else is built upon. Okay, so if it's inaccurate or misunderstood in any way, then everything else that is built on top of that will also be built on a weak foundation, therefore will be inaccurate. The second part that I'm interested in is your emotional responses. Now, these happen much faster than you can think yourself. So say, as an example, 5 times faster than you can think. Therefore, if there's something that triggers an emotional response, it tends to happen much faster than you can think round it. And then whilst that emotional response has hold, it can then suppress your cognitive thought, which is quite a nuisance, especially if you're trying to learn something new. So you'll tend to find that you have to go through a repetition many times to get to the point where you feel comfortable enough that an emotional response doesn't take over. But there are other ways around that, and we're going to break those down a little bit later on. The final one that I'm interested in is your reactive responses. Now, if you think about how you drive on a day-to-day basis, going to and from work, your brain builds reactive responses through repetition. Okay, so if you're driving the same route to and from work every day, your brain builds up a series of reactive responses to certain triggers that it experiences on the way. These are happening in the background without your knowledge. Okay, so you end up with a system operating in the back of your brain that you didn't put there. It just happened all on its own. The cool thing is that we can reprogram those, okay? So you'll find that there'll be a lot of reactive responses, be it that they were built in general day-to-day on-road driving or in your motorsport experience. You'll find that a lot of those will be purely built through repetition. It's not that you've done them wrong or that you've understood something wrong. It's just the fact that you repeat something often enough that your brain thinks that that is correct and has stored it as a function. These are entirely programmable, and it's very important that in a motorsport setting, when you're looking for precision, that they're based on accurate cognitive thought and well understood and rehearsed processes. So these three areas are the ones that I'm most interested in as a coach, for obvious reasons, and we're going to break those down and look at them in a little bit more detail now, starting with your cognitive thought. So let's take a closer look at your cognitive thought processes then, and why they're so important. So there's many things going on here within your cognitive thought processes, and they're very dependent on lots of things that you've encountered in your own past experience, in your own life. You know, things like previous driving experience, your own education, your understanding of physics, and your understanding of how your own body works and things like that. So what I'll try and do is paint a picture of this so that it gives you an understanding of the things that I'm actually interested in and looking at whilst I'm going through this early stage of ensuring that you have the correct knowledge, the correct understanding and the correct interpretation of that. I can pick these things out from you whilst I'm sat next to you because I can see how long has it taken you to absorb information, how long has it taken for you to then put an input into the car. Is the input correct? Why is it not correct? I'm asking myself all of these questions all of the time based on what you're doing in the car. So I think it goes without saying that, you know, as a benchmark, you would have to have a sound understanding of physics. So not just the physics of the car, what the performance of the car is capable of, the influence of the outside world. So we're looking at surface types and different types of gradient cameras, changes in weather condition, how that influences how you can take on board information. All of these things play a huge part. So there has to be a great understanding of physics. You can even argue biology, so that you understand how your own body works. So that would then lead me on to systems of information gathering. So we take for granted that our senses take on board information day in, day out. It happens all the time without us even paying attention to it. In a motorsport setting, I found that it's very important that we hone those senses so that you're not just, randomly looking at things. You're actually training yourself to look for certain things as you're driving around. Therefore, you're building up a process of shortening the time from where you're actually seeing something that's of great use to you, being it picking out an apex or an obstacle. It doesn't really matter what it is, that you're looking for very specific things all the time, and you're training your brain to target your eyes to those certain areas. You could even break it down further than that, where you can actually break down which part of your field of view you're using to track certain objects or certain points of interest. You can actually utilize your peripheral field of view as a means of gathering information, as well as your central and focal field of view. Just to give you an example of that, the peripheral vision you can get round accurately, say 60 to 80 degrees in either direction from dead straight, whereas by comparison to your central focal vision is usually laterally 5 to 8 degrees, which is tiny. So it's very important that whatever you're using that detailed focal vision for is something that's accurate and essential, where there's anything else can be passed to your peripheral and then leave your central focal vision free to look at something else. And where that really helps is it gives you that freedom of movement in the car, where you can comfortably turn your head without feeling uneasy, and that's one area of confidence that I would work on. Okay, so systems of information gathering, knowing what to look at, when to look at it, what to feel for, and what that actually means in the way of information. So you're tying that visual cue, that sense of feel that you've got back from the car, to a usable piece of information. So what does it actually mean? So that would then lead us to a system of interpretation. So you're gathering information, but what does that information actually mean? What does it relate to? Then you would lead on to a system of operation. So you're gathering information, you're processing that information, you're then going to turn that information into a usable function, so a system of operation. And all of these things work hand in hand. You could then argue that for each of those operations, each of those systems that you've developed, your information gathering, your system of interpretation, your system of operation, they all have errors. You need to know what is too much, what is too little, which would give you then a range of operation. So you need to then know what is your absolute maximum range of operation when it comes to how far ahead do you look, how close to the car do you look, all of these things. How much effort do you put into the car, how much speed can you carry into a corner? They're all given to you through sensory input, and you need to understand really accurately what is a maximum and minimum of that range. You also need to understand how to correct that. So by that I mean, if you do too much, what do you need to take away? Which part did you do too much of? Was it a sensory input thing that you got wrong? Was it a processing of that information, the interpretation of it? Was it that was wrong? Or was it the amount of effort that you put into the car in the end? Was that wrong? And then you need to know what you need to do to correct that. So all of these things I give as tools. I describe them as being tools to the driver, so that they can then understand how to remedy and fine-tune what it is that they're doing in the car. Okay, there's a huge list of things that I would go through, but they have to be done in a logical sort of process. And because each and every driver is very different, this process is very different for each and every driver, for the obvious reasons. You've got different rates of processing information. You'll see things in a very different way to what I will or every other driver will. We have to take that into account. Your understanding then of everything forms the root knowledge and foundation on which everything else is going to be built on. Okay, so it's very important that I can see within the driver that these things are correctly understood in a way that makes sense to them. So it's pointless that it makes sense to me. I need to make sure that it makes sense to you. Just because you can carry out the function and you can repeat it, it doesn't mean that you understand it. It just means that you've gone through the motions. I need to see quite clearly that you understand what it is that you've done, and that I've certain ways of doing that with certain drivers. Let's say each and every one of you are very different, so it's very important that I pull that information from you as we're going round. As I said, the ability to identify errors and correct things is really important, because ultimately what you're trying to achieve is a refinement in everything. So you're trying to take away the amount of effort required to do anything. So the amount of effort that you're putting in to gather information in the first place, the amount of effort that it takes to process that information, the amount of effort that it takes to get the car to do what you're asking it to do. The better you can refine each of these things, the less time they take, and ultimately the faster you're going to be. So let's take a brief look at the emotional responses then. Now, annoyingly, these are going to happen, and always, you know, way faster than you can think round them. I said before that if you think that they'll roughly happen 5 times faster than you can think round them. The annoying thing here as well is that, in fact, there's 2 things I want to touch on here. Is the emotional response can quite often be triggered by your thought process. So if you're thinking that something isn't going to work, or you have doubt, or you're just simply overthinking a scenario, the chances are then that you will lead into having an emotional response, okay? The emotional response will happen very quickly, and at the same time, whilst your limbic system, this is where your emotional response comes from, the limbic system will then suppress your cognitive thought, okay? So if you're having a very strong emotional response, it's very common to freeze and have a very much reduced performance when it comes to thinking of your way out of that particular problem that you just put yourself in the first place. There are many triggers for emotional responses. Every driver is different, so the most common ones that I come across are fear, frustration is definitely one, and what I would refer to as a default action, okay? So fear and frustration are fairly straightforward. When you're being pushed and stretched to the limits of what you feel comfortable with, getting moved from where your comfort zone is into like a new area is always going to be tough. So you're always going to have fear, anxiety, the fear of the unknown is going to creep in. You don't know what's going to happen next, therefore you've got that case of self-preservation. The other is that, you know, if you're working in a car that you're familiar with, in a setting that you're familiar with, and I'm asking you to do something new, you have these what I call default actions, so that I'll be asking you to approach a corner in a very different way, maybe holding your power on a little bit longer on the approach so that you're carrying the speed further into the corner, you know, just as an example, using less steering or maybe a different timing on the brakes. It's really hard to get you to the point where you will do that when your brain will always want to default back to what it feels comfortable with and what it knows from the past. It's quite hard to push through. But what I really find interesting here about your emotional responses is one, what triggers them. So what made you have that response in the first place? Because if I can identify that quite early on, then we can get rid of it really quickly. There's always ways around it. And the other is paying attention exactly what response you got from that emotional response. So was it a weird input on the car? Did you freeze? You know, what was it that caused that? And then there is always a way around this. And usually it comes back to what we talked about first, is having that strong foundation of, well understood and rehearsed knowledge and information at the start. So if you can get to the point where you firmly understand something, you've managed to push yourself through that comfort zone to the point where you're able to repeat it and carry it out, you're able to then fine-tune it by saying, oh, that was too much, that was too little. You've refined it to a point where you feel that you've got it now. Then you'll find that if it was scaring you before, or you were feeling that you were slightly apprehensive about it before, even though it was far beyond what you're currently capable of in the car, then you're no longer afraid of it anymore. So there's an old saying that I think the PARs use, for example. When I was in the RAF, you quite often see this written on doors where the PARs were stationed. It was that knowledge dispels fear, and it absolutely does, but it does it through a very logical way. You're no longer afraid of something that you understand, and not so much that you understand it, you've actually gone through the process of carrying that function out many, many times. So it's not just the fact that it's knowledge dispels fear, it's the knowledge and repetition of that particular function that gets rid of the fear. Okay, so the default action isn't necessarily it's not necessarily an emotional response. It's actually come from your reactive responses, as in it's a system that your brain is already comfortable with, that your brain has automatically revert to in a scenario where you felt uncomfortable. Okay, so these things can be quite a handful to get rid of. Okay, so your default action, chances are it won't be correct. It's very likely it won't be correct, because I think out of all of the drivers that I've worked with, very, very few have ever been correct to the point where they're as good as they could be. Some of the reactive responses have been very dangerous and ended up putting, certain drivers in very precarious positions. So these are things that I like to pay attention to. They can take up to, I think the sign states, up to 3 weeks, up to 21 days of repetitive training to reinstill a new muscle memory or a new reactive response. Whereas I've had very good results within 1 to 4 days, depending on the driver, certainly nothing more than 4 days. So these are all things, certainly from an emotional standing, that I'm interested in. What causes that emotional trigger, through to what's actually happening once you've had it, so that you're then aware of, this is the important thing, is actually making the driver aware of, for one, what caused that trigger, so that then they can take ownership of it and work around it with me, rather than me just saying, do this. They need to understand that that caused that to happen, okay? And the other is making sure that they understand that what the reactive response was, making them aware of that reactive response, that it was dangerous or inaccurate or it could be better. Because if you're unaware of it, how can you fix it? So then I think finally we're going to look at the reactive responses. So moving on to your reactive responses then, this is where the magic really starts to happen. So everything that you've worked on up until this point, everything that I've been helping you with up until this point, is trying to get the systems in place so that you have the correct background knowledge, information, understanding, and the correct physical process of those systems and the correct understanding of those systems to be able to rehearse and practice things on your own, to the point where we're both happy with what the outcomes are. The repetition of these things and the lack of these emotional responses getting in the way then lead to these reactive responses developing. Now, there are two scenarios that need to be in play for these reactive responses to develop. One is that you must achieve repeatable outcomes. So everything that you do has to be repeatable. So if you're getting different outcomes for every time that you try something, it's very hard for these to be stored as a reactive response. The other is that if you're having emotional responses connected to these training scenarios, then it's highly unlikely that these things will be stored as a reactive response. So repetition and comfort and confidence within these systems that you're practicing are absolutely essential for forming these reactive responses. Now, I've said this is where the magic really starts to happen, is purely because the more of these reactive responses that you have, be it for gathering information, processing information, or actually putting a usable function into the car, the less you have to consciously think about things, okay? So the more reactive responses you have trained for certain scenarios, the less you have to consciously think about certain things as you're going around. And what that does is it frees up lots of extra processing power, so you could then be more relaxed, feel that you have more time to process other things that are new, that need your cognitive thought. So regardless of how experienced you are and how much you've done within your driving career, you'll always find that there's something new every time that you go out, and having that free space to be able to capture that new information, hold on to it and process it as you're driving around is actually very useful. It helps you grow and develop as a driver. But if you're already running at 90% and you're taking in lots of information and gathering and processing that data every time you go around and everything is new, you'll find that you'll always have a very high rate of cognitive thought process, which isn't very useful. So you'll also find that you'll fatigue easy, you'll get tired very quickly, and chances are, because of your cognitive thought process is not being correct, you're not having correct systems in play, you'll find that your inputs on the car will also be wrong, which means it'll be inefficient, which means you're exerting even more energy. So it's not just mentally exhausting, it's physically exhausting as well. The cool thing as well about these reactive responses is that they happen 20 times faster than you can think. We said this already. Here, when they're correctly formed, when they're actually built on known, trusted information, they're going to help you, okay? So in scenarios where you feel that you didn't have time to do things before, you're going to have oodles of time now and a lot less to worry about. But it is absolutely essential that these reactive responses are built and constructed on well understood, rehearsed systems, okay, so that you're not just winging it, rather than from your own driving background, be it that it's just to and from work, or whether you've had lots of previous experience out on the stages or out on the circuit, going through the same process time and time again. As I said before, you build up these reactive responses without you being consciously aware that they even exist. It's very important that in a motorsport setting that you have a conscious awareness of constructing and building this, so that the repetition is deliberate and targeted, and that you know that that system is being constructed in the background, so that you know that it's there. And because you're aware that it's there, when you actually carry out that particular function when you're out on the stage, you'll have an inkling as to whether, when it was carried out, was it too much, was it too little? So you'll be able to see the outcome of that. And chances are it should fall within the usable range that what we said we would set earlier. So if it was slightly higher than what the ideal was, you can then say, well, next time it needs to be dialed down a bit, and so on and so forth. But because your brain understands these ranges, you'll find that it'll happen all in their own as well. So if you had, say, a single venue where you're going around the same stage two or three times, you'll find that the second time that you go around, you'll be a much neater, much tighter line through a particular corner than what you were before, purely based on the systems that were already in play inside your head. So reactive systems, very important that they're constructed from the knowledge that we talked about earlier, that they're deliberately rehearsed rather than just allowing to evolve in the background, and to be aware that they happen so much faster and that you can learn to trust and embrace them. You know, so this is ultimately what we're trying to achieve, is get you to the point where you're thinking a lot less about what it is that you're trying to get the car to do, based on all of the other things that you've learnt, practiced and rehearsed leading up to this point. And the more of these things that you can break down and rehearse and develop systems for, the more effective you become as a driver. So all of the extra hard work that you do at the lead up to this point really pays off, because you end up thinking about less when you're in the car. Okay, so it's a really wonderful place to be. The repeated use of trusted reactive responses and well-trained systems leads then to an accurate anticipation of things that you'll be able to see into the future a certain degree. With a fairly high degree of accuracy, you'll be able to anticipate that with this input, this is going to happen. And because you can do that time and time again, it allows you to see into the future for a very small period of time, which is really cool. That's a very nice advantage to have. I wouldn't say that it was 100% accurate, but it certainly, in my opinion, allows me to sit quite comfortably next to drivers that I don't know, which is a useful thing on its own. So hopefully you found the information within this video interesting, and it gave you like a little snippet of how much information is really batting around in my head whilst we're going around, let alone what's going through your head. I'm very busy whenever I'm watching what's going on. I'm not really interested in the car, I'm interested in the driver. You know, I could say that I'm not interested in what's going on around on the outside either, to a degree, but when you're on a circuit, that's quite hard, especially on something like a track day where you've got lots of other vehicles around. So I'm very busy, you know, going through what I should be with the driver, but at the same time having a second eye on what's going on around. Unless, of course, I'm with Dan Elmore, which in the Metro is almost impossible to see outside because the wing mirrors are like this big, and the way that they're set, I can't see a thing anyway. So Dan's been very good at keeping us safe in that scenario. But as I say, I hope you found it useful. And if there's anything else that you'd like me to go in any greater depth of detail, then please just say. Remember when we were doing the COVID Carvid videos, I always asked, is there anything you'd like to know more about coaching? And a lot of the questions that I got, they weren't coaching questions, they were instructional questions. They were, how do I do this technique? How do I do that technique? Which is fine. I'm happy to share that information, no problem whatsoever. It's just that please understand, certainly from my point of view, that from my opinion, that there's a huge difference between coaching and training. Okay, when somebody's teaching you how to do a technique or how to utilize the car in a certain way, that's very instructional. It's very you know, this is how you do something. You're learning something new. It's an instructional phase. When you understand that knowledge and you have a grasp of that knowledge, you will then find that you have further limits. And these limits were what I talked about earlier, these emotional limits, where you kind of hit a barrier or a brick wall. And the only way you can get through that is by having somebody extract that confidence from you. And that's the difference, in my opinion, between what is an instructor and what is a coach. So the coaching side of me is what enables me to get that extra bit of performance out of you by eliminating those fears, by giving you a better understanding of things through further training if required. So there is a definite difference there. So again, hopefully you've enjoyed this this video, that you found it useful, that it's given you an insight into how I operate in the car, albeit it's a very small part of it. And I enjoy doing the videos. So if there's anything else, just say, pose the question, and I'll throw another video up. Thank you.